Hello, everyone. In this episode of How I Stumbled Across Jung, I am with Michael Vannoy Adams. Michael is an internationally prominent Jungian psychotherapist in New York City. He is a clinical associate professor at the New York Postdoctoral Program in Psychotherapy and in Psychoanalysis. He's been a Marshall Scholar in England and a Fulbright Senior Lecturer in India. He's written quite a few books. The one I'm reading at the moment is For the Love of the Imagination. And firstly, welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
And I wanted to say I have been rereading your first chapter on how you became a psychotherapist this morning, and in For Love of the Imagination. And, I think it's a lovely chapter, beautiful chapter. And I wonder whether you could maybe we could start. Just one thing I want to say before we start is that when you're talking about growing up in Texas, which might be a little bit similar to Western Australia, actually. I think Texas is copying Western Australia, if you ask me. But the sense, the sense of space. And, I was thinking as, perhaps a introvert, where I could really relate to what you were saying is that as an introverted child, maybe, and that great sense of space in the country, but it's a sense of imagination too, isn't it? Like there's that room for a big inner life. And that's very much what I got from how you started your memoir. But over to you. How did you stumble across Jung, and how did that begin?
Well, that little essay I wrote For Love of the Imagination, which then became the first chapter of my book, For Love of the Imagination, is the only piece I've done that's a kind of autobiographical statement. It's a rather short chapter, so it doesn't have a lot of the detail in it that I suppose we're going to get into this evening.
Yeah.
But it starts off, that chapter starts off with me talking about my childhood and being an only child until my parents, 57 years old and 51 years old, adopted my brother and sister from South Korea. And they were Korean American war orphans. So I suddenly had a brother and sister when I was 9 years old. But before that, I was an only child, and I was a late child to my mother, who was 41 years old when I was born. And so that wasn't common at that time. There were no sort of special reproductive technologies and things like that. This was her last chance. And so she was thrilled. And so, I had the whole world to myself in a way with my parents. And they were also older parents. My father was born in 1900 and my mother in 1906. All of my childhood friends, their parents were 20 years younger or something like that. And so my sort of psychological reach went back in some funny way into history a couple of decades earlier than theirs did. And it's like my beginning was 1900, the way the interpretation of dreams was. That's how I thought about things. And I still think of those things. It's like going all the way back to, the electric light bulb and the record player and the telephone and, all of the motion pictures and all of those things. Like 1909 when Freud and Jung came to America to get their honorary doctorates. I mean, that's like my father was not that old. Freud was really a 19th century person and Jung was more of a 20th century person. But by 1900, one of them was, in his 40s and the other was. So, it's like I could go into all of that. And the fact that I first of all started on a 10-acre nursery because my father at one point had inherited the fruit trees and flowers and shrubbery and all that sort of thing that he sold. His father had this nursery in Northeast Texas. Or I could then, when my grandfather on my mother's side, who had a farm, when my grandmother died, we moved out there to take care of him. And that had been a 100-acre farm, my brother says, and then was about 75 acres when we were out there. And there was a railroad across it, and there was a highway across it. And
Mm.
I didn't know anybody, and it was all within the city limits. It was right at the edge of the city limits. And
Mm.
Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, lived a quarter of a mile up the road from us and was a family friend. So, and he helped to get my brother and sister adopted from Korea. So, I mean, it's all, that was my world. It was a much vaster world of imagination and things
Yeah,
than some of my friends at that time. But,
being
you know,
an
if you're
only
asking,
child, and I can relate to that as well because I had older sisters. One was 8 years older and one was 10. But it's kind of like somehow left to your own devices there. But the other part that I found interesting, maybe was, you really came in through Freud to Jung, it seems to me, and you had a girlfriend and she was studying Freud, and there was Herbert Marcuse and Norman O'Brown and discussions. And so can you tell us a little bit about that? Like when you went to study, what happened then and how did you get on to Freud and all of that?
well, I always wanted to be a writer. And when I was in high school, I was the editor of the student newspaper.
Yeah.
And I participated in these interscholastic league contests. And so I won the junior year, next to last year, and my senior year of high school. Those contests were in Fort Worth, Texas.
Hmm.
That's Will Rogers and Bob Wills and all of that. They call it Cowtown, or the gateway to the West. And I'd really never been to Fort Worth because Dallas is closer to my hometown. Now they've got DFW Airport and all that, but at that time, they weren't sort of thought of as twin cities.
Right.
But I had always thought I was going to go to Southern Methodist University, or SMU, in Dallas because one of my uncles had played on the football team there in 1913 or something like that. I'd never thought of going to TCU or Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. But because these contests were held there when I was in high school, and I won the gold medal one year and the silver medal the next, the people in the journalism department there, they all encouraged me to come there and study there with them. And so that's what I ended up doing. And so I wanted to be, I don't know, I wanted to write opinion pieces for the New York Times or something. This is my
Right.
fantasy. So I was going to
Yeah.
change the world by being Walter Lippmann or something like that.
Yeah.
And, anyway, I ended up at Texas Christian University, or TCU, in Fort Worth. And
Yeah.
I had actually a very good experience there in 4 years. And so part of it was, majoring in journalism and in history and in starting into that sort of extroverted world. I mean, I
Yeah.
really wanted to be a writer of fiction and pure imagination ultimately, but
Right.
I started out learning how to write in a journalism program. Yeah.
Michael, can I ask you one question there? How old were you? Can you consciously remember when you first just, thought you wanted to be a writer? Did that happen when you were very young or?
Um, well, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that question, but when I was a child, reading the comic books, stories, the
Yeah.
Tarzan book, the Hardy Boys, all of these kinds of things, or going to the Saturday morning movies, the serials, Buck Rogers or Tarzan or Superman, and all that sort of stuff. All of that, I suppose, had some growing influence on me. And and when I was in high school, I think it really, I didn't know how quite to get back to it. I mean, my childhood imagination, and but so that was, in some funny way, um, um, an avenue into that.
Yeah.
Although anyway, I ended up at TCU thinking I'm going to be a writer and a journalist, and I have a wonderful experience there. And
Yeah.
I become the editor of the student newspaper. But first, I become the editor when I'm just my second year there. I become the editor of the student yearbook. Now, no universities in America these days have an actual yearbook, but then they used to, and it was a big deal. Every student would go get his or her photograph taken, and the sororities and fraternities had been all this sort of stuff, and the sports thing. It was a big fat book and all that. And I edited this thing in my sophomore year. A journalism professor I had been a big civil rights journalist at the one of the big civil rights newspapers in the South. He had written a novel that was a civil rights novel about a racial murder. He had been working on the Texas Observer, which is a liberal biweekly in Austin, with Willie Morris, who then became the editor of Harper's Magazine. And then Willie Morris he was a Rhodes Scholar, and he had gone to the University of Texas from Georgia. And they knew a man named Larry L. King, who ended up becoming famous eventually by the Broadway musical and movie, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. So there are all of these writers that suddenly this journalism professor, his name was Jay Milner, introduced me to through him. And I met Willie Morris, the editor of Harper's. I met Norman Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. They all came down to Fort Worth.
Right.
And
so you were getting drawn into that world,
yes,
that writing
and it was
world.
absolutely this was like the cluster of people in Texas who wanted to, like Larry McMurtry became the novelist, who was more I don't know, successful as a novelist and got movies made like The Last Picture Show and HUD. But there were a lot of these others too who were the real deal, and they were working for major magazines in America and all of this sort of thing. And I was let into their
world.
Their world. Yeah. And so that's how I ended up in the summer of 1968. There was a national competition that the Washington Post had for interns every summer. And so my journalism professor corralled some of these people like Larry L. King and I don't know, maybe even Willie Morris, and write little letters about me, and I ended up being one of about 15 or 16 people from across the United States who were going to be summer interns on the Washington Post. Now, this is 1968. It's 4 years before Watergate, where everybody becomes interested in the Washington Post. It's before Deep Throat and Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein and the resignation of Richard Nixon.
And
So,
were you burning incense and were you a hippie at that time? A closet hippie, perhaps?
I wasn't a hippie at that. No, that was about a year or so later or something like that. But in 1968, it was all about the Vietnam War and politics and you see, I went in the summer of 1968 to Washington, D.C. I'd never lived anywhere else, and I drove my little white Ford Mustang from Texas to Washington, D.C. And as soon as I hit town, and I was in downtown Washington in my little car, the first thing I saw was John Kenneth Galbraith, the 6'8" economist, who at that time was the head of the Americans for Democratic Action. And that very day on my radio, I had heard they had made something. They were meeting there. And there he was on the sidewalk, and I pulled over and I yelled out, Mr. Galbraith. And he walked over, looked in the car, and I took a photograph of him with my Pentax camera.
So you were kind of thrown into the world of the shakers and movers, let's call it that.
Of journalists and politics and Vietnam and protest and all of this sort of stuff. And Johnson was a Texan, right? And the guy who lived a quarter mile up the road, Sam Rayburn Johnson, was his protege, as a Speaker of the House, And so, this is, the president from Texas he announces in March 31st, that he will not seek re-election because, unlike everybody else these days, he sort of thinks that there might be too much turmoil in the country. So he bows out in advance to save everybody turmoil. And so Hubert Humphrey and Gene McCarthy are in the race with Nixon at that point. Okay, and then so that's March 31st. And so on April the 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated.
That's a huge time, isn't it?
Like
1968 seems like the I don't know, just the zenith of the whole revolution.
I'm telling you, it's the truth. And then in June 5th, Robert Kennedy is shot, and on June the 6th, he dies. Now that's all happened in like 3 or 4 months right before I go to Washington. I get to Washington when all of that has happened. And when I get to Washington, the first thing I'm doing on the Washington Post is all of the interns are assigned to go down to the Washington Mall, where there's a giant tent city called Resurrection City, where the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Ralph David Abernathy are holding the Poor People's Campaign. Like it's the biggest protest in Washington since the I Have a Dream thing with Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
So we're thrown into that to report on that collectively for the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Now that's my world there. We were shifted for different beats every 2 weeks, partly to make up for vacation, the people on vacation who were the staff reporters on the thing. So one of the things I ended up doing was going to Maryland at some point, and then I'll stop the journalism thing. But I went to Maryland and the Washington Post office out in Maryland. And when I was out there, I was thrown into covering the retrial of a racial murder. The retrial of a racial murder. It had there had been some kind of mistrial in the first case, and so they had rescheduled the thing. And so here I was doing that. And it was some white kid had a little older white kid on a school bus had I don't know, pushed around a younger black kid. And then the next day, the little black kid's older brother came and pushed around the white kid. And then the next day, the white kid's father came down there with a pistol or something and said, something like either you black bastard or you black son of a bitch, and killed him. And so at that time you had actual file cabinets, and it was called the morgue in a newspaper, and they had clippings. So I went in there to write my story the first day, and I quoted this, "you son of a bitch" or something, right, in my article. The next day when I went to the court, immediately the defense attorney called me, summoned me, and accused me and the prosecutor of colluding, because he couldn't figure out how I'd got this quote, except it had been told to me by the prosecutor, and I was prejudicing the case. So here I was, 20 years old, shaking in my boots,
thrown in the deep end of the outer world,
called to the witness stand to like being accused of a crime here. But I have an actual Xerox copy of the clipping in my pocket, you see, so I'm sitting pretty. So at some point I pull this thing out like I'm a magician, right, and say, well, here's where I got it. It was in the Washington Post 2 years ago, something like that. Okay.
Right.
Now, so unfortunately, that trial ended in another mistrial for various reasons, and so they decided not to retry it a third time. But that was. So
Michael, you're kind of I don't know. You're a person of the imagination, and perhaps an only child, or whatever, and then you go to Washington, thrown into the maelstrom of these outer events, which is a pretty significant time in history and all of that as well, isn't it? And how did you get the first connections back again, though, to the inner world or the imagination or Freud or whatever? How did that happen?
Well, that was the summer of '68, and then in the fall of 1968, when I went back to Fort Worth, that's when I met this girl. Before that, all of us were beginning to read. We were reading Herbert Marcuse's book, One Dimensional Man.
Yeah.
That was our gateway into Marcuse. Yeah. And then after I had read that, this is kind of like getting involved in hippie New Left stuff, those two streams, because they were two different things. One was more external and one was more internal in some way, okay?
Yeah.
But
there were people around, weren't there? Like, I'm a little bit younger than you, and in the 70s, I remember the Marcuse and Norman O'Brien and that. They were it's kind of like they were these intellectuals that had read Freud and all that, and they were applying it to the social world around us, weren't they? And they were writing interesting stuff.
Well, you see, I don't know exactly when One Dimensional Man was published. It was published in 1964, so only 4 years. So it was the hot read for young people at that time.
Yeah.
But then reading that book led me back to Marcuse's book earlier, Eros and Civilization,
yeah,
which was published in 1955. And in turn, that led me to Norman O. Brown's book, Life Against Death, The Psychoanalytical Meaning of History, which was published in 1959.
Yeah.
And so that's where I was reading. Both of them were calling for an end to repression, and both of them meant it in somewhat different ways. Marcuse was much more external, and into repression was a synonym with oppression for him.
Yeah.
You know, I think probably Brown was always truer to the inner world and thinking that oppression and repression are two different things, okay? Or he moved in that direction anyway.
Yeah.
And so they were calling for an end to repression. I was by that time 21 years old, and that had a lot of sex appeal to me. And Freud, coming through those two people, through that lens.
Because Freud was about the end of repression, wasn't he? In one way.
Repression, and that it was my first encounter with a comprehensive, systematic explanatory system of human motivation. For other people, it was Marx or some other kind of thing that gave them an entire worldview. But for me, there's Freud and Freudianism. So now that's the fall of 1968. The spring of 1969, I meet this girl, and I want her to be my girlfriend. She's obviously the smartest girl at the university. She happens to be a psychology major. Well, I didn't. Did
you go for the smartest girls at the university?
Of course, I still do. My wife right now is smarter than anybody else in New York.
Excellent.
You know, except for me, maybe one day a week. But she was a psychology major, and the reigning psychology at that time, so-called, was behaviorism, of course.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, like one of my professors later, Sigmund said, it's psychology without a psyche. and so
that's funny. It can also do your head in as well as your psyche.
Now I'm going to ask you to go back in time travel back to a time before Me Too and all of these kinds of things, okay? Because we're back at a time before everybody was accusing everybody of sexual harassment and so forth and so on, okay? And even though this is a so-called Christian university, it's not, you know, underneath this particular denomination. It's affiliated with them, okay? So they don't have required chapel and stuff like that. This is a very liberal Protestant denomination, okay? Very middle of the road, okay? But on the other hand, it's still kind of a conservative. It's not Berkeley at that time, okay? It's DCU and Fort Worth. And there's a psychology professor there, and he is into, he's not a behaviorist. He's the only psychology professor there who is not doing these kinds of things, right? He's into encounter groups or T groups or what were therapy groups, right? It's like
progressive.
So he is also talking about Freud and worse than Freud, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Right.
Okay. Now this is a volatile thing to be whispering in the ears of co-eds at Texas Christian University.
It's a wonder he didn't get sacked.
Well, at that time, it was a different time, and people on both sides had a different attitude toward getting together. Let's put it that way. Anyway, he was a bit of a Svengali or Rasputin, and you have to remember that this is also, apologies to Quentin Tarantino and, you know, Hollywood movies and things, but this is the summer of 1969. This is the spring of 1969. In the summer of 1969, this is Charlie Manson and the family. Okay, it's like these are kind of people who have a kind of a magnetic kind of influence over certain people, right? And so that's the time when that kind of thing. I mean, it still happens today, of course, but there was a particular kind of atmosphere at that time. And so
you had those people with this incredible charisma that was swaying people. And another one I'd like to throw into that mix was Timothy Leary. You know, he was a person that influenced a lot of people. But I wouldn't see him in a totally negative light, but he definitely had that kind of, you know, charismatic person coming onto the stage or whatever.
Yes, yes.
Mm,
Well, that's very powerful stuff.
yeah,
Some people it's heady, okay, and it's easy. It's not so easy to maintain self-discipline or keep your head or something like that. And
yeah, yeah.
it's interesting to see who does and who doesn't. But this person would tell students that they were middle class, used too much salt on their food, and were therefore repressed. Okay,
Well, maybe that's
and then
true.
he would dare them to become unrepressed. And now I
Right,
guess you understand where we're going with this. The way to demonstrate that they were unrepressed was, of course, to have sex with him,
right,
right? In fact, including like a threesome with him and his wife.
right.
Now, he was not an old 90-year-old professor or something. He was a kind of a rather young professor, and he worked out and stuff like that, okay? And he was kind of part of this new mood, right? Like
It's
we
free
all
love,
thought.
isn't it? Free love. It's the
Well,
free
yes, and
love
we also
behind.
thought we also all thought at that time that no earlier generation had ever really had sex. And
Yeah,
the revolution was we were the ones who were really the first people to
finding
have unrepressed sex. How
finding
could you
it
be
for the
against
first
that?
time in history.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous. Okay. And then he invented something called a sperm cocktail, you see. Now, I was never over there at, his house or whatever, okay? I'm just telling you that this was part of what was going on. And
Yeah,
this is the collective psychology of the post-World War II generation.
yeah,
And you could call it the mass psychology of hedonism.
yeah,
It was liberation, sexual politics, Playboy philosophy, feminism, birth control,
yeah,
co-ed dormitories, the Vietnam War, make love, not war. And then I meet this girl and I want her to be my girlfriend. And
yeah.
she's working with this guy. She writes her senior honors essay. She's 1 year old. She's a little bit younger than I am, but she went to college a year before I did. So she's going to graduate a year in advance. She's writing her senior essay, and it's on Freud and the scientific method. And the question is, was Freud a scientist by some definition? And so I start talking to her, and she tells me that Marcuse and Brown are not using the word repression in a technically correct sense, you see, and that basically, if I
What
want to get
what what would
anywhere
you
with,
say? What would you say about that now, looking back?
oh, well,
Do you
she's
think she
absolutely
was
right. Absolutely right. Absolutely
so?
right. They were
They had kind of loosened it up into a
they
social,
were playing fast and loose with it for their own purposes.
right?
Okay, I'm grateful to her, even in that sense. I mean, she was right. Okay, and
Yeah.
so I went over to the library and I found the 24 volumes at that time it was 23. The index hadn't come out, but
Oh,
I saw those things there, on the bookshelf at the TCU library, and began to read the standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud.
so
Okay.
he's had a big effect on you, really, hasn't he? Like he is an influential person within your life, Sigmund.
Oh, of course, of course. I've read the standard edition 4 or 5 times all the way through, and I've read Jung's collected works 4 or 5 times all the way through. At one point, I was so naive, I thought that everybody who was interested in these things had done the same. But
Yeah,
then I had to sort of sit back and say, well, no, Mike, they haven't. They
yeah.
haven't, they don't have quite the same interest in this that you have, okay? And you are expecting too much from them, or some other kind of thing. You're going to make a fool of yourself with these assumptions of yours, okay? And so
Well, a
then
lot
that
of people
next
don't. A
summer,
lot of people don't read, and if you're a voracious reader, I know
well,
this is a simple version, but
at that time I wasn't, but I became one in the next 2 or 3 years.
yeah,
For many, many, many years, I'd read 4 or 5 books a week, and that's
that's a lot.
I can't do that anymore. Anyway, that then the next semester, I transferred down to the University of Texas at Austin,
Yeah,
where I became an aide to a state senator down there, and I took a course at the University of Texas from an intellectual historian named Robert Crundon, and he was in what was called the American Civilization program there, which was an interdisciplinary program. And he had written a book, From Self to Society, 1919 to 1941. It was about modernism in America. And I thought this was just the best course I'd ever taken. It's like a lecture thing with 100 students there, something like that. I thought, well, this is what a real liberal arts education is like, you know. And so
Right.
when I went back to TCU, you know, I had a different attitude about what I was looking for in my education.
Were you
And
still turned on to journalism and all of that?
yes, I was. In fact, you see, that summer of 1969, after I'd been at the University of Texas, that's when I became a reporter intern on the Atlanta Constitution. And I chose that newspaper. It's now the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Back then, every major city had two newspapers, right? But now they combined that, and it's the Journal-Constitution now. But it had the other great civil rights editor on there, Ralph McGill. He
Right.
retired, in fact, just before I got there. But what I had done the summer previous on the Washington Post, I was now doing in Atlanta. And you know, I told you and laughed about it. I covered the Atlanta International Pop Festival that summer, and Led Zeppelin was there, Janis Joplin was there, and I interviewed Delaney,
But
Bonnie, and friends.
but did you
Yeah,
dance at that, Michael? Did you dance? If
I
I could
wasn't
ask
quite.
that very private question.
Well, the next summer, I went back to that thing at the Atlanta Speedway, and it was 1970, and they had a much bigger cast, and I was sitting right beneath Jimi Hendrix, you know, on July the 4th, going into July the 5th when he did the Star Spangled Banner and all this.
Yeah,
Now, I have to
which
tell
is
you,
genius.
the 1969 Atlanta Pop Festival was a month and a half before Woodstock.
Yeah, just
So
an
like
incredible. It's an incredible time. It really
it's
is.
like the Pop Festival. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Then it all became a big thing, you know, after that.
It's
Anyway,
like
yeah,
everything's been, from me, it's like everything was thrown up in the air. Like you could say the 1950s was maybe a bit repressed, and then there was this just movement to the other side and everything. And some of it was so exciting, and some of it was so scary, with the child
yeah.
and you were talking about. But it's kind of like everything was just thrown up in the air at the same time, you know?
That's right. And so I had these two streams going. One is the external thing through journalism and politics and all that. And the other thing was an internal thing through
Yeah,
psychoanalysis and the study of ideas and
yeah,
the inner world, the intellectual, psychological world, you might say.
yeah,
And so through this experience of working on those two newspapers, it's not exactly as if I just suddenly halted journalism stuff.
yeah,
I continued to do some of that, but basically, I was coming to the inevitable conclusion that journalism, reporting, and doing legwork and interviewing people and all that didn't suit my personality, and that suddenly this intellectual world had opened up to me
yeah,
through Freud and all that. And so I happened to get, I graduated from TCU with in the spring of 1970. That summer, I went off to a hippie backpack trip to Europe with my girlfriend, this particular girl. We went over there and we landed at Heathrow and we went into London. And the very first thing I did was we went right down to Trafalgar Square, and I found exactly where the Hogarth Press was. And I marched in the front door of the Hogarth Press. It was a little woman behind a little desk there. Nothing was fancy in those days. I
yeah,
walked up there and I said, I want to buy the collected work. I'm going to buy the standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud.
yeah.
And so I plunked down my traveler's checks or whatever they were at the time, and I bought the 23 volumes. Now I'm going to show you what I'm calling a libidinal object. Okay, you see this thing there? That's
I
from
can't
1970.
can't read
That's
it.
50. That's 50. I know it's 55 years ago, but it's a Chatto and Windus Hogarth Press receipt for the
Ah,
23 volumes to
fantastic.
be shipped back to Texas
It's
while
fantastic.
I'm going around Europe. Okay, but there's the little piece of paper that's got a lot of libido invested in it. That's where
Yeah,
my real serious interest in Freud begins.
yeah,
Okay,
that's
and
good.
so then we then in the fall of 1970, I got this fellowship, and I ended up at the University of Texas. Somebody had gotten the fellowship. It was there were one class of federal fellowships in America at that time for graduate study. It was a full ride. It was called a National Defense Education Act fellowship. The only way they could get the federal government to fund scholarships for graduate students was to say that if we don't do this, the Russians are going to do something else. So it was in the defense. I went to graduate school in defense of my country. Okay, I mean,
Right.
this is funny to me. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's how somebody else, a woman, was offered the scholarship, and then she pulled out and went to the University of Michigan. I had already received a rejection letter, and I guess I was thinking I'm going to be a journalist, but then suddenly I got another letter from them saying she's turned it down, and you get the scholarship.
Is this the Marshall? Is this the Marshall Scholarship?
No. This is the National Defense NDA Fellowship.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay.
I go to Austin for a master's degree, and in the fall of 1970, and I enroll in the program where this guy was the intellectual historian, where he's the graduate advisor, Robert Crundon, the guy who wrote the book on modernism. And guess what course he's offering that fall for the first and only time? A course called Freud in America.
Right.
So now, like my God, this they've redesigned their program just for my arrival, and so I couldn't be happier. And this is Austin before Elon Musk and everybody else wants to move there. Okay.
Yeah.
Like Austin is like turning into Houston or LA now. It's getting so big. Okay. But back then it was the best kept secret in the whole world. Yeah. And you had the music scene was starting. You had like the other places had the Fillmore East and the Fillmore West, but Austin had something called the Vulcan Gas Company. It was all mythological. The underground, right? Underground comics. Gilbert Shelton was in Austin with the Furry Freak Brothers. All of these people were in Austin, and the Armadillo World Headquarters, okay, was there.
What's Armadillo? And, what's Armadillo? Sorry, I'm.
You know what an armadillo is, right? It's a marsupial. It's got a little pouch and all that. It's got an armor.
They're like a kind of a cousin of the kangaroo, or the wallet. And
there's something. I don't know. Well, I'm not. Maybe
anyway.
I'm not sure. Maybe I don't know whether they're marsupial or not, but they're a very ancient creature. They used to be called the glyptodont in prehistoric times. There's a glyptodont in the American Museum of Natural History here, a skeleton one. They looked like the size of a Volkswagen back then. Now they're like smaller people, but they're kind of like having armor plating on it. Okay.
Okay.
But you see, that became a kind of countercultural symbol in Texas and in Austin at that time. Like the hippies were all into armadillos and things.
Oh, okay.
And so you had sex, drugs, marijuana, LSD, peyote, psilocybin, all of that down in Austin. And then here I was in this program with this professor that I thought the world of, and he was offering this course, Freud in America. And so how did I get into? And then I went in for his advisement, and I said, the other course I want to take is a seminar on William Faulkner. And you know what he said to me? I'd never heard anybody speak to a student like this. He said, don't take that course. The professor's a turd. Right?
He wouldn't be saying that in the present environment, I can assure you.
And so he said, take this guy, take the Melville course. I'd never read any Herman Melville at all. I'd read some Faulkner and stuff like that.
Can I say one thing there, Michael? Isn't it? I think James Hillman writes about this, is fortuitous, the twists of fate and chance or whatever, and how one is led into something. It's one of those stories, isn't it? It's like,
well, I like it that James talks about following your nose. Yeah. That's really what I've done, and I'm not sure that there's not some trail of scent there. Okay, I'm not into some definition of synchronicity that omits me as the common denominator here. Okay, because I think that's the problem with people who mystify synchronicity, is that they forget that they are the person who's linking all these things up. Yeah. And so when somebody else would have been at the same place in the same time, but would have not they wouldn't have been ready to regard the Freud in America class. See, I'm just laughing when I say they designed it for me.
Yeah.
See, I'm not saying God arranged all of this. All right.
No, but
So,
it's there's some, what do they say? As below, so above, or as above. But I mean, there's some connection between the microcosm and the macro.
But I'm going to insist that I'm the person who's making that connection here. Okay. And
Okay.
anyway, I end up in the Herman Melville course, and I begin to understand that the Melville revival of 1920, because nobody had been reading Moby Dick basically for, I don't know, 70 years. It was published in 1851, I think.
Right.
But in 1920, a biography came out by a Columbia University professor, the first one, and then it became something called the Melville Revival. And Lewis Mumford and various other kind of people started writing these biographies. And this was simultaneously with the interest in Freudian psychology and Freudian literary criticism. So all of the biographies were psychobiographies or pathobiographies about Herman Melville, and explained all the symbolism and the white whale and all that, sort of in Freudian and usually phallic terms.
Can I ask you one question? With Herman Melville, was he, how was he intuitive about all of this symbolism, or had he been well studied in?
Well, let's postpone the answer to that question until we get to me at the University of Sussex. Let's just stay here. Then that first semester in Austin, and I'm encountering Herman Melville simultaneously with the course on Freud in America. So I've got the Freud in America, I've got a heavy dose of Freud there, and then simultaneously I've got this other course on Melville where all of the criticism I'm reading is Freudian. So I'm getting like a double dose of everything there, and I'm in heaven with this kind of thing. And so, and one of the great Melville scholars is none other than Henry A. Murray. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right? I mean, he was, okay, well, you know Christiana Morgan and the vision seminars that Jung did?
Yes, yeah.
Christiana Morgan was Henry Murray's colleague and lover for many years. Okay. And they were co-inventors of one of the 2 or 3 most important projective tests in psychology, the thematic apperception test, or the TAT. Yeah. There's the Rorschach, there's the TAT, and then there's the word association test.
I always try to stay away from those Rorschach tests anyway, I can tell you that, because but yes, I understand what you're talking about.
And so Henry Murray, he's what they call a Boston Brahmin. He is like old upper class Boston, Back Bay, that sort of thing. Right. And the Harvard Psychology Clinic is a kind of a combination thing for undergraduates. You know, they can go down there and get some therapy or something. It's also a research thing where they do studies and things like that. Mm. And the first head of the clinic was Morton Prince, who was the friend of William James. Right. And Morton Prince was also hooked up with Freud. He wrote a book called The Co-Conscious. He wrote a book called The Unconscious, but he talked about co-conscious. He was as interested in Pierre Genet as he was in Freud. And eventually he fell out with Freud, all that, because he wasn't kowtowing to like the Freud party line. But anyway, there was Morton Prince, and with it's like the 3 Faces of Eve and all of that sort of stuff, multiple personality and dissociation. And that's the Genet wing. The Freud wing is repression instead of dissociation. And Henry Murray is in all of that mix at Harvard. After Prince, Murray becomes the head of that clinic. Okay, and so another funny little thing is, guess who was one of the people in one of the research studies at the clinic of a research thing that Murray was supervising? the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski.
Oh, right.
He went to Harvard when he was, I think, 15 years old. Oh no, he's 16 years old. When he was 17, he entered into a 3-year study where these people were subjected to these undergraduate men, about 22 of them, including Ted Kaczynski, were subjected to what Murray called vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive interrogation. This was funded by the CIA.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, Murray and these people in World War II had been in the OSS, which was the precursor of the CIA. These are the people with Alan Dulles and all this that Jung was writing psychological profiles of Hitler for, the OSS. Okay. They were collecting information on the Nazis and psychological profiling and all of this sort of stuff. So
Okay.
like Murray's part of that generation of World War II people who fought the Nazis and all that, and then came back and did these kinds of experiments,
It's
right?
kind of, it was an experiment on human beings, really, wasn't it?
Yes, but it was in the Cold War. You see, they gotten rid of the Nazis, but they still had the communists or something, and so
Yeah.
that's why they justified these kinds of strange experiments. Okay,
And psychology let loose in its
yeah,
infancy, you know?
yes, and Kaczynski said this was the worst experience of his life. Was
Yeah.
this 3-year thing? Okay, I don't mean that made him the Unabomber, but that's
Yeah.
another little curious story here.
Yeah.
Anyway, Christiana Morgan and Henry Murray, they went over, and Murray was analyzed by Freud, and then he was analyzed by Jung. Christiana Morgan did all those active imagination things where she painted all her visions, and then you got the vision seminars that Jung did on it. Murray and back in New England, Murray and Christiana Morgan, they made their own tower. They built their own tower and had wood carvings in there.
I can remember reading where Jung said to Christiana Morgan, put all this down in a book and write it as best you can. And in this book, you'll see your soul. And it's quite lovely, you know.
Well, it is, and then it's also sort of seductive and enticing, and it gives people some inflated ideas about themselves and all of these things too. You know, this is again the problem with charisma and all that. You know, if you don't exude it, they will project it onto you, I suppose. You know. Anyway, Henry Murray had written this famous essay called "In Nomine Diaboli," because Ahab in Moby Dick says, not in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, but in the name of the devil, I will be pursuing the white whale.
Right.
Okay, like he does a satanic pact, like a Faustian bargain,
right,
to go kill the white whale. And so Murray, who is this big figure in depth psychology, like a huge figure in it in America,
yeah,
and then he's also like the hugest and richest Melville scholar. He wants to write the great definitive Melville biography,
right,
but he never can do it. He's one of these guys who cannot write a big book that he wants to write. And so this essay is big. I met Murray once at a meeting of the Melville Society at the New York Public Library years later. He was wearing a little tweed jacket the way he would. He was impeccably neat and proper. And there he was, you know, Henry Murray, or Harry Murray, as he liked to be called. You know,
he's the Brahmin of Boston, were you saying? Is that him?
Yes. I mean, he is and there he was. Anyway, and then, of course, me being, you know, the jerk that I am, many years later, after I had been married once, divorced, and then had remarried. On that second honeymoon, of course, I took my new wife to the Berkshires, Western Massachusetts, on her honeymoon to Melville's hometown, and you know, which is the Berkshire Historical Society now. The Athenaeum, or the library in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, has a collection of Melville memorabilia and stuff like that donated by Henry Murray, and a couple of portraits of Melville's mother on the wall, the oil paintings, 19th century oil paintings of Melville's mother, one coquettish and one like housewifely, okay? And you know, the barn is there, the house is there that Melville wrote Moby Dick in, okay? And so we were, like, I'd been there before, and I was my wife was an English professor and all that, so she wasn't uninterested in seeing
Is this
Herman.
what English professors do on their honeymoon? That is the next
Well,
question.
I'm
But
going to show
anyway,
you my next libidinal object. You see this?
yeah,
This is not like a nail from the true cross, okay? Like in
right,
medieval times, they say
yeah,
this is a relic from Jesus or
yeah,
the Shroud of Turin.
yeah,
But for me, it's like a holy thing, like that little receipt a minute ago, okay? This
yeah.
is a nail from Herman Melville's barn in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where
Okay.
Melville and Hawthorne used to go to that barn and talk what they called ontological heroics in the hay.
In the hay.
Yes,
Um,
and they told each other like we can't help ourselves, but talk these ontological heroics. And you see,
the way I would put it, that nail has mana energy in it.
and do you see what's on the back of the whale, giving it authenticity? It's an ink stamp of a black whale. Okay, there we are. Okay,
Oh, cool.
so it
That's
tells you
cool.
that this is the real thing and not a facsimile. All right.
That's
So
cool.
now see, that's got all of that stuff in it. Okay, and so um, I don't know how much time do we have left.
We've well, we've been going for about an hour, and usually try to keep it as an hour. But what we could do is maybe go for another 5 or 10 minutes, and we can make two parts.
Okay,
Why don't we do
I'm
that?
gonna get to the University of Sussex and all that sort of thing.
Yeah,
So after all of this, I go
yeah,
back to the University of Texas in 1971,
yeah,
and I won't say too much about that. Although I will say I met Sigmund Koch, who was one of the great psychologists of the 20th century in America.
yeah,
He was chosen by the Ford Foundation to edit this projected 7-volume Psychology, the Study of a Science,
yeah,
which was going to be a synoptic evaluation of the state of psychology in the 20th century.
yeah,
He didn't do the 7th volume, which he was going to be his volume, because he thought he concluded at the end of doing all of the first 6 volumes that, as he put it, psychology could not be a coherent science.
right,
Okay, and so he became a kind of Thorsten Veblen. What Thorsten Veblen was to economics, Sigmund Koch became to psychology, a kind of a gadfly and all sorts of other stuff. He's the guy who said psychology without the psyche. Okay, and so he was a very big, profound influence on me. And then I also met Michael Polanyi, the great philosopher of science, who was a fellow at Merton College, Oxford, and all of this sort of thing. And so he had written his great book, Personal Knowledge, and another great book called The Tacit Dimension. And so these were big, profound influences on me.
yeah,
And that's why I say I'm not a kind of monotheist here who was only influenced by Carl Jung or by Freud or by Melville.
yeah.
I have been very fortunate
Many
in having
influences along the way.
so many great experiences like this.
Yeah,
Anyway, but that's when I met at the University of Texas that spring, in spring of 1971. I met my first Jungian analyst. There was a woman in one of my seminars who said, "Well, there's a Jungian analyst just up the road in Salado, Texas." And I said, "Oh, is that right? I've never." He said, "Come up there. He's doing next week, one evening next week. He's going to be showing the BBC interview with Jung." And I had never seen it, and it was going to be a film. It was like on an old
yeah.
projector with a reel.
With the
It
pipe,
was Harry Wilmer.
Jung with the pipe. Uh,
Yes. And but
yeah,
the analyst was Harry Wilmer.
right.
He was a guy who had moved to Texas from San Francisco. He was the big trauma guy. He was the first Jungian and other people to do kind of group therapy with what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder with
Right,
veterans,
right.
from and then later with Vietnam veterans. He was a
Yeah,
very important and interesting man.
yeah.
But anyway, that's we saw the face-to-face BBC interview there.
And what did you
Uh,
think of it?
oh, I thought it was fabulous. I still think it's a wonderful interview.
Oh,
I like all those interviews, including the Houston interviews, which are kind of raggedy and stuff like that. But I think it's cool also that somebody from Texas at the University of Houston, which at that time was like a commuter college,
Right.
you know, it was not a major university. Now it's a major university, but it used to be a commuter college. And there was one guy in the radio, television, film department who got the bright idea to go. He interviewed Erik Erikson, he interviewed Carl Jung, and he interviewed somebody else I can't think, some Harvard psychologist who was important at that time and writing on prejudice. And so that's why we have the Houston interviews.
It's
And
kind of like like I remember again, you know, other people like Erich Fromm, and like you had these European intellectuals that had gone across to the US and started speaking, and that, you know, it was what was it? The popularization of psychology was beginning too, wasn't it? And but some of them have been grounded in depth psychology, like Erich Fromm had, you know, and then they wrote these very popular books.
These people down there, it's like, I mean, there's so many interesting anecdotes and things like that. I don't know. What you're talking about is the immigration of basically Jewish analysts to America and primarily New York, and that's another fascinating story.
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. And Fromm is just a tiny little part of that story. You know,
there's many people.
There's Karen Horney, there's Theodore Reich, there's all sorts of other people that we could talk about a whole thing there. Anyway, I graduate from the University of Texas, and I write a kind of psychobiographical study of Thomas Jefferson. And so this is my master's thesis. And then, you know, in the meantime, I have applied for a Marshall Scholarship, and I get a Marshall Scholarship. And at that time, there were 24 Marshall Scholarships awarded in America, as there were 24 Rhodes Scholarships. There were only two big prestigious scholarships, the Rhodes and the Marshall. The Marshall was in gratitude in commemoration of the Marshall Aid Plan after World War II. It was funded by Parliament. And so, you know, I mean, the Rhodes Scholarship is still it's the oldest and all that, so it still has a slight prestige edge. Stephen Breyer on the Supreme Court, who just retired, and Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court are both Marshall Scholars. So those are the big public Marshall Scholars at the moment. Okay, but you know, this was an important thing for me to be getting. It meant I could have 2 years and maybe 3 years of fully funded study in England, basically to study all of this Melville stuff and to write my dissertation on it.
Was that
exciting?
Was that exciting for you?
Now we get into how I stumble across Jung.
Yeah.
Okay, because
Well, I've got an idea, Michael. I mean, maybe let's cut this into two parts, and then
okay.
The part two will be
the next part is going to be my going off to England from Texas, I guess, right?
Yes.
Okay, sounds.
Yeah, no, that'll be good. And let's do that. So we'll do that as soon as we can.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.